Hello, hola, bienvenidos. This is Susanna Temkin. I'm one of the curators at El Museo del Barrio. Very happy to be here today with multidisciplinary artist Kristina Aguilera Skvirsky. Karina and I are going to be talking a bit about her practice and just some background on this interview, this diálogo remoto as it is. Karina was slated to be part of El Museo del Barrio's curatorial platform at Frieze New York called Diálogos. For the second year, El Museo had curated this section, which aimed to bring together Latin American and Latinx galleries to Frieze New York. Of course, unfortunately, that program was canceled due to the current global pandemic. So we're really happy to be speaking with Karina and hearing a bit about her work via this platform instead. So Karina, I'm just going to do a very brief introduction about you, and then we'll just start talking together. So I noticed on your website that you describe yourself as having a practice that was born in photography that grew into video and performance, and I hope we can talk a little bit about that development of your work. But I also want to mention that last year in 2019, you received the Anonymous Was a Woman Award. You also received a Creative Capital grant for the development of your project, How to Build a Wall and Other Ruins, which I would love to talk about because I know in some ways you've been working in the digital world on that. And you have been in numerous group and solo exhibitions, including the current show, Geometría Sagrada, at the Museo Amparo. So anyway, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Susanna, and thanks to El Museo del Barrio for the invitation to show in Diálogos. And as I keep saying, like, we have other opportunities coming out of this pandemic. So I'm really happy to be here with you remotely, but in real time. And I'm also, I also want to thank my gallery, Ponce Robles. They are in Spain right now, and of course the pandemic is global, so they were hit before we were. So I'm just sending out my love to them, and they've been an amazing, I think, collaborator with me, and we're really excited about going to Frieze. So I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, well, and maybe we can talk a little bit more about your relationship with Ponce Robles, because I think it's interesting. I mean, your personal identity and your background, which is really central to your work. You are a Latinx artist with Ecuadorian roots, working with a gallery based in Spain. And in a way that sort of you summarize what we were hoping to talk about, to dialogue with as part of Diálogos, is to explore some of these different and intersecting ideas. So can you tell us a little bit about who you are?
Yeah, so I think that's a great place to start. So I was born in the US, but my mother's Ecuadorian. My father is American of Eastern European Jewish descent, and my parents met in New York in the early 60s. My mother was part of what we in Ecuador called the first wave of immigrants that left Ecuador for, in this case, mostly to New York. And she emigrated at a time when you didn't need a visa, where you could just come and stay if you wanted. So she met my father, and yeah, they got married and had me. And I grew up in mostly in DC, but because my mother is a teacher, we went to Ecuador almost, I'd say, every other year.
I always found it really interesting, Karina, because you do seem to, I know for certain generations, and maybe depending on what generation Latinx you are, or where in the country you might be from, there's sometimes more of a distance between your home country or your family's heritage. And I always found it very interesting that you work, at least it seems to be fairly seamlessly, or you're well embraced by both the artists that are here in the US, but also in Ecuador. You're very much a part of, you're not seen as an outsider, as I think other artists sometimes experience.
Yes, I think, and I'm not sure, I don't even understand that exactly. Like, my connection to the Ecuadorian art world really happened in 2009, 2008, I would say. And I have to say, this was one of your questions that you sent me in the email, like my connection to El Museo del Barrio. So I participated in the S-Files in 2005, which bled into 2006. And so I went to the opening in 2007, which happened to be the country. The way the S-Files worked is there was a curator from a country invited to curate a section. And that year, it happened to be an Ecuadorian curator who, Rodolfo Cronfle Chambers, who happens to be from Guayaquil, which is, of course, the city where my family is from. And I was just blown away by the work from the S-Files, the work that he curated into that show, the artists that he brought from Ecuador. And it was like, I understand this work, I feel connected to this work, I want to know who this person is, I want to know who these artists are. And I guess, like, it's good to go to openings, because even though I just had a baby, there I was, and I met him. He gave me his phone number, and I was working on these things are sometimes like serendipitous. I happened to be working on my first project having to do with Ecuador after many years of like trying to figure out how I wanted to talk about that part of me that's like so important, that I understood as part of who I am. I didn't know how to do it, and then I had sort of figured it out. And so I was going to Ecuador that summer to start working on it, and he happened to be there, and I called him, and we hung out, and I went to this incredible school that was called ITAI. It's now Universidad de las Artes, University of the Arts, and it's now a public university. And I met these artists and professors, and they were just amazing, the work that was being done and the conversations. And they welcomed me in, like they did, as their own, even though I see my work as like kind of about being in between spaces, and about being Ecuadorian, not Ecuadorian, being American, not American. Like, that translation ended up being very easy somehow.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm gonna shift us over to look at some of your works, and I just wanted to mention, maybe we'll go a little bit out of order of what I have on here, but I first got to know you a little bit through this project of yours, The Perilous Journey of Maria Rosa Palacios, which in many ways I feel like it really embodies a lot about your practice. One thing about your practice that's very prominent is your bodily insertion into your work, as well as your research into your family history, your thoughts about labor and gender. I mean, this is a 30-minute film in total. I put the Vimeo link if anybody wants to see it. But it's a really amazing project that I don't know if you want to say anything about, Karina. It's very sensitive.
Yes. So this project, I think, it's everything that you said, and a really important project for me because it's part of, one of the things as you develop as an artist is how ambitious can you be, right? And this was a really ambitious project. It took years of research and a lot of legwork to get the funding in place. Maria Rosa Palacios was my great grandmother, and I always knew this. I never met her. My mother never met her. She died pretty young, in her early 50s, we think. And my mother, I think she was in utero. So I think that was about 1944. And she was from a small town called Chota, which is really Chota is a town, but it's also the Valle de Chota, which means it's a valley where there are multiple towns. And so this area is really important in Ecuadorian history because it's one of the two areas where Afro-Ecuadorians come from. And my great-grandmother was Afro-Ecuadorian, and she left Chota when she was a teenager, we think pretty young. And then she migrated all the way from Chota to Guayaquil. What I figured out as I began to research is that the railroad, there were no cars at the time that she would have made the journey, which was 1906. And the railroad wasn't completed till 1910. So the question was, how would she make such a crazy journey? And I had done research about how people traveled before the railroad, and it was really, really, really difficult, really perilous, in fact. And so the project became a reenactment of that journey, that's the central part of the video, but it's also very much about the changes or the ways that people traveled and the way that the landscape shifts as I travel through from Chota to Guayaquil.
I mean, even explaining that, you use the word "we think she may have," and that's one of the, I think it's the crux of this piece. This parafiction is how I've heard you talk about it. You also once mentioned to me historias falsas, or false histories, sort of. I guess in some cases there are gaps in knowledge, but in other cases I think that you really dig into these themes in history, or you play with this concept of fact versus fiction in creating your narratives.
Yes. Yes. And that's like a bit of a thread throughout all my work, and comes from my photo background of the aura of truth that's around photography. And in this case, it's like with my great grandmother and that story where she leaves to go work as a domestic in Guayaquil, and she was very poor. How do you reenact something where there are so many details? I guess the bigger question is, who tells stories about a poor Afro-Ecuadorian woman who leaves her home to go work as a domestic in a big city? A very common story. Who tells that story? Where do we know those details? How does that, how do we learn about these people except through our families? And I think for me, like even the families, there are all these gaps in memory, and you know, she died so young, so we didn't hear much from her. My grandmother's already dead also. So, you know, in piecing it together, I was really interested in those gaps, right? And kind of filling them in, but also allowing them to kind of sit there without making sense. So the video doesn't actually make total sense in terms of like a normal, or I would say a traditional narrative, right? And it's also a hybrid. It's like kind of documentary, but kind of performance.
Yeah, I think I mean, you don't just piece together this history. I mean, you insert yourself into it. And I think in some moments we look at you and we really see your great grandmother, and in some moments we look at you and we really see Karina in the 21st century, you know, re inscribed in this history. And there's these certain anachronisms in a way that add a really specific texture to this piece.
Yeah, I love the way that you put that. And I mean, I was really interested in collapsing. I can't be her, right? I'm not her. But her DNA is in me, you know, and she's part of me. And there's all of these, you know, psychological studies about how, you know, you don't just pass along DNA, but you also pass along a kind of almost like a trauma and I see her journey, it could only have been traumatic.
I want to maybe from there go to I didn't make the slideshow in order, so we could talk anyway in any part. But I mean, this your railroad workers series, which I don't know what came first, but they're very much parallel projects. I see it since the root of Maria Palacios' story is that there was no railroad, and part of the reason why was this need for labor, which you sort of reinscribe into these works. But again, I mean, in these two pieces, again, you're not trying to trick your viewer into a seamless image. I mean, it's in a way very obvious what we're looking at, because these laborers or these people on the journey, they really, I mean, they stick out from what we're from the rest of the photo.
This project really comes out of the studio, my studio practice, in which I was thinking about my great grandmother as a migrant, and I realized in my research that the people that built the railroad while my great grandmother was doing her journey, it was in production, were also migrants. They were from different parts of Ecuador, mostly indigenous workers that were being basically moved around to work on the railroad, and they were migrants from Jamaica that were immigrants that had been brought to build the railroad. And so that parallel was really interesting to me, because it also, she was a domestic laborer, they were, you know, industrial laborers. Like these huge projects from the early 20th century that we, you know, take for granted were built with human labor. The U.S. railroad was also built with human labor, immigrants from China. So it's like these stories are sometimes, you know, we think of progress, but we don't think of how things were made. And the railroad unified Ecuador is really important for the identity of the country. But who did that? And luckily, there are actual photos of the people that made that happen. And so it's like their labor is embedded in the landscape. And that's what I was really thinking about, how to show that visually.
literally excavating some of that into your piece.
Yes.
Well, I mean, since we're talking about how your thoughts on migration, migrants, labor affect or inspire your work, maybe we should talk about, I guess it's your current project, How to Build a Wall.
Yes.
I'm not sure if I have any images of that. We can go to the top because I want to make sure we also talk about Inga Pirka before we go.
How to Build a Wall in Other Ruins is really like, one, thinking about how the Incans built their walls, and two, thinking about the wall that Trump wants to build. And so part of it is tongue in cheek, and part of it is an entry point to like think about this culture or this engineering feats that have not necessarily been lost because it's been written about, it's been talked about, but thinking about it in this other way of like actually having relevance to our contemporary conversation about what walls are built, what are they for, right? So Trump has an idea of what they're for, but that's totally different than the idea that Incans had. And so the idea is like, if Trump is going to build a wall, then why not use, Inca technology to do so?
Yeah. And so, I mean, related to that, I think in some of in thinking about the Incan technologies and thinking about who did it, you've also talked about gender, the gendered labor of building a wall, and I think that relates to a piece like what we're seeing on the screen now, which is also part of your Inga Pirka series, and in a way I guess it's a self-portrait. I don't know if you would consider it a self-portrait.
In some ways, yes. In some ways, yes. Yeah. So this is a rock that I found around the site of Inga Pirka, and yeah, I have been photographing those rocks, and then definitely because history is subjective, and so it's kind of literal of me, but I am putting myself into that history, or I'm putting the female body into that, because women's roles are less understood or less thought about or less explored, sometimes, especially in relationship to something so macho as building a wall, right?
We had talked once about like maybe how you might be read in the same legacy of somebody like Ana Mendieta, right? Or there's like a feminist land art discourse as well to these pieces.
Yes. And I have to say that I didn't see that until it was brought up to me, maybe by you.
I wish I could take credit for it, but it's certainly, I think it is there. And I think even if it didn't intend to be, I think that's an interesting parallel practice. I mean, it's a very different practice at the same time. In a way, I mean, Ana Mendieta was physically imprinting herself into the land, and yours is, again, this more playful, I mean, you're in the rocks, but you're not in the rocks, and what are you doing? And
yeah. So I see them as sort of fake performances. So yes, hers were real performances, and mine are, again, using the medium of photography to play with that truth, that it's a kind of accepted as, it's like it's clearly not real, but because it's photographic, it's believable.
And so, I mean, what are you working on now?
So right now I'm just trying to like calm down. But I'm one of the things that I did that is not on the website yet, and that is, I'm realizing is kind of related to this moment that we're having, and I'm thinking about exploring it more. And one of the things that I was going to do for Diálogos is include a series of portraits of different people from Ecuador and my own family, including myself and my partner here in the US, with rock masks, or rock faces. And I can send you, I've made 2 of them. And so they're in the museum in Amparo right now.
So you were thinking about masks before masks took on a whole different meaning for us here.
Yes.
Interesting.
And I guess I was thinking of them as like hybrid, like in the same way these are hybrid body rocks. I was thinking about hybrid faces, like rock faces. But now I've started to think about them as more like masks, like thinking, and also what's new is I've started to, and I don't even know if I want this to come out because I haven't made it yet. I don't even know if it'll work, but we can figure that out later, is thinking about the way that a mask can be performative. Because now that I'm wearing a mask out in the streets, there's a like, it's not performative. It is performative. It's like performing safety right now or something. But how does a rock mask, how does that perform in some other way? Does it become like a camouflage in the landscape?
Yeah, it's interesting because, I mean, previously I only thought about masks as a way performative. You put one on, you can become something else. It's a freeing, liberating thing. And I never really thought about the protective qualities of a mask, even though the protection is built into that sort of liberation.
Yes, yes.
So
That's such a great point. Yes. So I'm thinking about I'm thinking about masks. I'm actually thinking about masks that are face masks, but also that are body masks, like I'm so scared to go outside. So it's like, I'm starting to think of like an entire rock around me that would, kind of somehow protect me in the outside world.
Well, you can definitely, I think, do some internet diving on the different engineering feats that people are coming up with to protect ourselves. But rock, that's a whole different approach.
Yeah.
Well, Karina, thank you so much. I'm going to pause our recording.
Okay.
And unless you have any last words.
No, just thank you so much.